Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Colorado Division of Real Estate and the Department of Regulatory Agencies, which is DORA. And today we have the pleasure of having our director, Marcia Waters, do her second segment that touches on important real estate issues for consumers. Today's installment is going to talk about engaging and interacting with licensed real estate professionals. And we did survey questions in advance. And we're going to go through those after each segment. And if you have other questions, you can put them in the chat box. Also, don't worry if you miss something or you have to leave early. We will be recording this so you can watch it later on YouTube. So I'm going to turn this over to Director Waters. And Director Waters, thank you for doing this again, and it's all yours.
Well, good afternoon. So we're going to walk you through the 3 different licensing programs that we have oversight of, and we'll start you off with the largest and oldest program that we have, which is the real estate broker program. So when you're looking to work with a real estate broker, we have over 51,000 licensed brokers in the state of Colorado, so there's probably a good chance that you know a real estate broker or know of one, or have gotten some advertisements from the brokers that maybe farm your area. If you don't know a real estate broker, or you don't have one that you're confident in their abilities, what we would recommend is that you interview multiple brokers before engaging one. And it's important that when you're interviewing them, that you ask them about their experience, because not all brokers practice in the same areas. Real estate is a pretty diverse arena, and you could be dealing with a real estate broker that does land transactions when you're looking at kind of a residential subdivision transaction. So you need to know what type of experience they have. In addition to asking about their experience, you're going to want to know how familiar they are with the area that you're looking at real estate in. So if I'm located in the Boulder area, but I'm looking to buy property over on the Western Slope, I need to find a broker that is familiar with the Western Slope. Once you have the conversations about their experience, it would probably behoove you to ask for references so that you can check those as well. But you're also going to have a conversation about compensation. And the important thing to understand with a real estate broker is that their commissions are negotiable, and they don't always get paid the same way. A lot of real estate brokers will make a percentage of the cost of the transaction. So if you're buying a house for $400,000, they may charge you 4%. There is no fixed rate though, and they're not allowed to do that due to federal law. There are also some brokers that charge flat fees. They'll tell you, for $3,000, they will broker your side of the transaction. They may even itemize the different services that they provide you, but just keep in mind that that is negotiable. But what you're also going to want to do when you're in the interviewing process with a real estate broker is you really should check our website, and we're going to show you how to do that here now, so that you've got a good example of what you're going to see. So Gary is going to pull up our website, and to find that, it's dre.colorado.gov, and he's going to go to the online services tab, or also there's search for a licensee that's up at the top. And then what you can do is just put in the person's name. And so Gary's going to use me as an example. So when you pull up my name, I have a broker's license, and it tells you that I've got a real estate broker's license. But the other thing that you need to look when you're checking our licensees is you need to check the status of their license. And so when you look at mine, it says that I'm inactive. And what that means for you as a consumer is I can't go out and practice real estate because I don't have an active license. And some of the other different statuses you'll see is active, and those are the ones that can represent you in real estate transactions. You may see somebody who's expired, and that means that they've let their license lapse. If you see that they are suspended or revoked, the commission has placed prohibitions on them practicing, and they can't represent you in a real estate transaction. So make sure that your licensee has an active license. And you can also go into the individual record, and if there's been a prior disciplinary action that is public, we provide a link to that document. Now, I haven't been disciplined. I would hope not, since I'm the division director. But if I had a disciplinary action, it would be under the section that says disciplinary actions, and you would be able to view the document. I wouldn't necessarily right off the bat, if you see that somebody has been disciplined, like that may be a non-starter for some people. You may want to do a little extra research though, because sometimes people get disciplined because they haven't done all of their required education. That's different than having practice violations where they may have made a mistake during a transaction. They didn't complete a contract competently. So it's probably a good idea for you to go in and look and see what the disciplinary action is about and make your decision from there. So that's how you search a license. Now, when you sit down and start talking to a real estate broker, chances are they're going to discuss with you about having you sign a listing contract. And pretty much most of the time, you're going to need to sign one of those. There is one scenario where you don't have to sign a listing contract. That scenario is when you are a buyer and you're looking at using a real estate broker as your transaction broker. And that means that basically they're just going to be a facilitator for you. The other situations, though, where you're going to need to sign a listing contract is if you own land or real property, and you're looking at selling it, leasing and exchanging it, or if you're a buyer and you want the broker to act as your advocate or your buyer's agent, you're going to need to sign a listing contract. And the important thing to know about a listing contract is this is a legally binding document. All of our commission-approved forms have language at the top of them that recommends that the consumer seek counsel, whether it be from an attorney, tax advice, or other type of professional. That's just kind of the warning for you that you are entering into a legally binding contract, and there are ramifications with that. If you're not comfortable signing a listing contract right away, if you want to evaluate the person further, we wouldn't recommend that you rush into signing something, but until you sign that contract, they can't start providing license services if they meet one of the circumstances that I described that requires the actual listing contract. So if you've interviewed a broker to help you sell your property and you've got kind of some hesitation about signing that listing contract, and you're waiting, they can't go out and start marketing your property for you. They have to have that listing contract in place before they start performing their license duties. So one of the things you may want to think about if you're anxious to start having those license duties performed is you can also negotiate a shorter term of your listing contract. Sometimes brokers will ask you to sign a listing contract for 3 months, 6 months, up to a year. If they're asking you to sign a listing contract for longer than a year, that is an action that really kind of falls under what the Real Estate Commission would deem unworthy and incompetent. You should not be signing contracts for longer than a year. They shouldn't be asking you to sign a contract for longer than a year. But if you've got cold feet, you may want to ask them for a shorter term. The important thing for you to understand, though, is once you sign that contract, you've got obligations, they've got obligations. You can't just cancel the contract. If you decide that you don't like them, you don't get to just fire them. If you want out of that contract, you're going to have to ask them to release you. If they agree to release you, I would definitely get something in writing showing that they're releasing you from it. But sometimes the brokers will refuse to release you from a contract. And then at that point, what you're going to have to look at is engaging an attorney. So just make sure that you are well informed about what is in that contract document. We have a lot of consumers that don't read their contracts. That is really a shortcoming that falls on the consumer. It's a legally binding document. You need to be reading it and make sure that you agree to the terms before you sign it. So I discussed compensation earlier. There's a couple things that you also need to be aware of when you engage a real estate broker and they start working for you. Now, state law basically says that anytime a broker is able to find a buyer that is willing, ready, and able to consummate a transaction and does so, or if they find a buyer that's willing, ready, and able to consummate the transaction, but the owner refuses or neglects to close, the broker is entitled to a commission. So keep that in mind. And the law speaks in that particular area about a seller. But another thing that you need to keep in mind is there's also something called procuring cause. And procuring cause is when the broker has taken actions that result in the consummation of a transaction. Oftentimes, if the broker has taken those steps, but for some reason you refuse to pay them, they could actually seek payment by suing you through a court of law, and that's called procuring cause. And we've seen that come up where consumers will use a real estate broker all through the transaction. They'll have a broker go out and show them properties. They will help them with negotiations, even with drafting the contract documents. And then when it comes to closing, the consumer says, no, I'm not going to pay a commission. And in that situation, I would not be surprised to see a real estate broker take you to court over procuring cause to sue for their commission. So in general, what you need to understand about the duties of a broker, kind of from the 10,000-foot perspective, is a real estate broker is responsible for bringing two parties of the transaction together and negotiating the terms. So those two parties may be the seller and the buyer in a sales transaction or an exchange transaction, or you've got landlord or tenant, because property management also requires the use of a real estate broker's license. So in the performance of just those two basic duties, they also have a lot of duties that fall under the license law. They're uniform duties that they have to perform. And I'm going to start off, there's two different ways a real estate broker can represent you. One is a transaction broker, and that's a facilitator, and I mentioned that previously. And then you've got a buyer's or a seller's agent, single agent to be just even more clear. And that broker is acting as an advocate for their client. So a single agent is going to have the same duties as a transaction broker, and they're going to have additional ones. So I'm going to go through the transaction broker duties, and then I will give you the single agent duties. So a transaction broker is responsible for performing any agreement that they make orally or in writing with a party to the transaction. They're required to exercise reasonable skill and care, and under reasonable skill and care, that includes presenting all offers and counteroffers. They're required to advise the parties regarding the transaction and suggest that expert advice get obtained. So expert advice may be when you get your title exception, if you've got a question, the broker is going to refer you to an attorney. Or, if you need to have the property surveyed, they're going to refer you to a surveyor. Those are the types of experts that may come up during the transaction. They're also required to account for any money or property received as a result of the transaction. Typically what we see is, you're going to put down an earnest money deposit if it's a sales transaction, or if it's a rental or leasing transaction, it's a security deposit. So the broker is going to account for those types of monies. They're going to keep the parties informed of the transaction. So once you've signed a contract to buy and sell, there's a whole bunch of dates and deadlines that you're going to have to meet, and that broker is going to help you make sure that you're meeting those dates and deadlines. And if you're not able to meet the dates and deadlines, the broker is going to help you seek an extension so that you can, or make any amendments to the contract that are necessary. The broker is also responsible for disclosing any material facts actually known by the broker. And so we typically see material facts come up as far as the property is concerned when the broker represents the seller. If it's got prior mold issues and the seller has notified the broker of that, the broker needs to disclose that. Or on the buying side of the transaction, if a broker is working for a buyer and they know that the buyer has no money in order to purchase the property and they don't have any likelihood of obtaining a loan, the broker is going to have to disclose that, because that's a material fact about the buyer's financial situation. Now, when a real estate broker represents you in the transaction, the consumer is not vicariously liable for the actions of the broker. The real estate brokers do have confidentiality requirements. So unless you allow them to share confidential information, they have to safeguard that. They're also responsible for complying with commission regulations as they're doing their services for you, and they also have to comply with state, local, and federal laws, including fair housing and civil rights laws. So if you're selling a property and you tell a real estate broker, well, I don't want to sell to this class of people, and that's a class of people that are protected under fair housing, that real estate broker cannot fulfill your wishes because they have to comply with the fair housing law. They cannot discriminate. So those are the basic duties of a transaction broker. In addition to those duties, a seller agent has fiduciary duties to their clients. So they're going to promote the interests of their clients with the utmost good faith, loyalty, and fidelity. And they're also going to counsel their clients as to the material benefits or risks of a transaction that are known by the broker. So they are, like I said earlier, they are definitely your advocate. Now, even though they perform a lot of duties, whether they're a transaction broker or a single agent, what we hear a lot about from consumers stems from a consumer not doing their due diligence. So you still need to play a really active role in this transaction. You can't just expect the real estate broker to do everything for you. You're going to have to select other settlement service providers that are going to be involved in the transaction. Like a residential transaction, typically most people are going to have a property inspection done. It's going to be your responsibility to find that property inspector and hire them. Just like selecting a title company, if you need to engage an attorney, that's on you as well. So just be prepared. You're still going to have to play an active role in this. You're going to get a lot of documents during this transaction, and it's going to be your responsibility to review those as well. And those are going to come by way of title commitments and exceptions. And you need to review HOA documents if the property that you're buying is in an HOA, because HOAs can put some pretty heavy restrictions on how you can use that property based on covenants. So it's your responsibility to read those documents as well. It's your responsibility to get your financial documents to the lender. Having the inspection done, it's going to fall on you to determine what you're going to seek to have repaired by the seller in order to close. And likewise, I mean, if the property is in a condition where you don't feel comfortable, you need to be communicating that to your broker that there's too many issues. You don't want to close on that transaction, and there's deadlines and clauses that can get you out if there's inspection issues. There's other things that come up about properties as well that really fall on the consumer's due diligence. So occasionally we get complaints because somebody buys a property and they find out that they have a registered sex offender living down the street. That is not something that the real estate broker is responsible for investigating. That falls on the consumer. Occasionally we hear about, well, I didn't know that my property was in the path of, airplane flight paths because I'm close to an airport. Again, that's part of your due diligence. Land use and zoning limitations, and also permitting and license requirements. So if you're looking at buying a residential property and you're going to run a business out of your home, it's on you to really do the due diligence to find out if the municipality where you're going to be living in will allow that, if there's any zoning issues, and if there's going to be any additional permitting or licensing requirements. So just make sure that you don't check out of the transaction just because you've engaged a real estate broker. The other important thing to keep in mind with a real estate broker is they are not allowed to provide legal advice. They are not attorneys. Their license does not permit them to practice law. They're allowed to complete contracts, but as far as legal advice is concerned, you need to seek out an attorney. And typically legal advice is going to come by way of title matters, HOA documents, special assessments come up from time to time. And sometimes people engage in more complex transactions like 1031 exchanges where you really need legal or tax advice. Another thing to keep in mind when you use a real estate broker is they don't have a duty to perform an independent inspection of the property or of the buyer or the tenant's financial worthiness. So they're dealing with information that is actually known to them. They don't actually have to seek out information about that. And then lastly, what comes up occasionally has to do with stigmatized properties. And under Colorado law, a real estate broker is not required to disclose what would be a stigmatized property. And some of the direction provided in the law about what would fall under the definition of a stigmatized property is if you've got a property where somebody who's been infected with HIV or AIDS has lived there, if there's been a suicide or a homicide or a felony committed on the property, those are things that the broker is not required to disclose. So if you're concerned, I doubt that you'll find out any information about people's medical conditions, but if you're concerned about a death at the property, or if there's been some criminal activity, go to the local police department and request a contact history of the property, and that can give you an idea of what has been going on. So that is what you need to know about the real estate brokers. And at this point, we'll see if Jeff has any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Marsha. That was a lot of great information. You answered quite a bit of the questions that we had come in earlier. We do have a few that you touched on, but may not have given an exact answer to. So I'm just going to go through them as they came in. Other than investigating complaints of allegations of violations of the license law, does the division perform any other oversight of brokers?
So we do go out and do financial audits, and that is for our audits cover two different areas. We look at their transaction files, but we also look at their trust accounts. And not all brokers have their own trust accounts, but typically when you're dealing with somebody that is doing property management, they do have their own trust accounts. So we will go out and audit those to make sure that the funds are being managed as required by commission regulation. And if there's missing funds, that is something that the real estate commission will definitely address with the real estate broker.
Great. So we talked about compensation. Can someone save money by not using a broker? And if so, is that advisable?
So you don't have to hire a real estate broker for your real estate transaction. It's going to really depend on what your knowledge level is. You can always get legal advice from an attorney, although they cannot do the exact same duties as a real estate broker. But definitely a real estate attorney could draft and advise you on contracts. So it's really up to you whether you want to engage in a real estate broker. I think most people do, just because it does lighten their load as far as what they have to deal with. I mean, I went over some of the due diligence that a consumer has to do. That's quite a bit, particularly for those of us that have full-time jobs. So to take on the additional broker duties, that just may be like too overwhelming for a consumer.
Great. So you talked about the responsibility of a buyer or seller to obtain different professionals on their own. If my broker recommends another professional, such as a home inspector or MLO, do I have to take their recommendation? And if I do, can I hold my broker responsible if something bad happens with that recommended professional?
So it's pretty common that consumers will seek some guidance from their real estate broker about, okay, so how do I find a property inspector? How do I find a title company? And the real estate brokers are fairly helpful as far as providing recommendations, because they're out practicing and they know the different professionals. You don't have to use somebody that they recommend. It is consumer choice. So you can definitely interview those other settlement service providers, and if you decide that you don't like them, you can definitely go your own way. And I do believe that if a real estate broker recommends somebody to you and they do a really poor job, there may be civil remedies that you could seek in that situation.
Great. Do I have to file a complaint with the Division of Real Estate before I sue my real estate broker?
So a lawsuit against your real estate broker and a complaint with the real estate commission can happen at the same time. You're going to have statute of limitations as far as filing a lawsuit. With our different programs, though, we don't have a statute of limitations. It goes back to the inception of the program. And with the real estate brokers, we've regulated them since 1925. So chances are, if something happened a couple years ago and you've been going through the litigation process and kind of holding off on filing a commission complaint, you could still file a complaint with the real estate commission. I will caution you, though, that the longer you wait to file a complaint with the real estate commission, it can be more difficult for us to investigate, because the brokers have a 4-year retention requirement for their records. So if you wait a long time, they may not have the documentation anymore that they would have to produce for a commission complaint. And also, I mean, really, any witness's recollection of the events can fade over the passage of time.
Okay, thank you. You talked a little bit about confidential information. Can a broker reveal my motivations to buy or sell to another party?
Not unless you give them your approval to pass that information on. Otherwise, they cannot share that.
Okay. And then you definitely talked about broker relationships, and I know you talked about transaction brokerage. Is dual agency allowed in Colorado?
Dual agency is not allowed in Colorado. So a broker cannot be an advocate for both sides of the transaction. And frankly, if a broker is an advocate for one side of the transaction, they cannot represent the other side of the transaction. They have to treat the other side of the transaction as a customer.
Okay. Okay. Those are all of our broker questions for right now.
So that will take us to our second oldest program, which is the Real Estate Appraiser program. And so the interesting thing that you're going to see when you look at our different license types is the appraisers are not out and about kind of advertising their services the way that the real estate brokers do, or even the way the mortgage loan originators do. I think for most consumers that are only going to go through like the home purchase transaction, you will never actually directly engage an appraiser. There's other situations where you will, but most of the time the appraiser is going to be engaged through the lender, and that's how you are going to just have your interaction with an appraiser. But what you need to know about the appraisers is there's 4 different license levels. And so when you do a lookup on our website, like Gary showed you with my license, it's going to have the license number. And for all of our license types, there's an alphabetical prefix that precedes the actual numbers on the license. So if you pull up an appraiser and their prefix is AV, that means they're an ad valorem license. They work for a county assessor, and they cannot do fee appraisal. And fee appraisal is what you would get if you were getting a mortgage or having other types of appraisals done. They are doing appraisals strictly for taxation issues. So you would not be working with an ad valorem appraiser. The other 3 types, though, do fee appraisals. So you've got an AL, that's a licensed appraiser. They are limited in practice to non-complex residential properties that have 1 to 4 units and a transaction value of up to $1 million, or complex residential properties that have 1 to 4 units with a transaction value of up to $400,000. And typically when we say transaction value, that is going to, if it's a mortgage transaction, that's going to be the amount of the loan. Otherwise, if there isn't a loan involved, it's the market value of the property. Then you've got CR, which is Certified Residential Appraiser. That appraiser can do any type of residential property without a limit on the transaction value. There are some exemptions as far as they can't do subdivision analysis, but that's not something you're going to typically see. And then you've got CG, and that's a Certified General Appraiser, and they can appraise anything. So if you're going to engage an appraiser, depending on what type of property you're dealing with, those license types are definitely going to come into play. So if I had a commercial property that I wanted to have appraised, I need to find somebody that's got a license with a CG, the Certified General. If I have just kind of the run-of-the-mill home that's, kind of in your basic subdivision, and the transaction value is $300,000, I could look at hiring an AL, a CR, or a CG. So just pay attention to the license types. They shouldn't be appraising beyond their level of licensure. That doesn't come up very often. Unlike the real estate brokers, where we have over 51,000, we only have about 3,000 appraisers. So chances are you probably don't know one if you need to engage one. And you're going to probably have to go on a Google search to find an appraiser, or you could contact a trade association and they could probably point you in the right direction as far as who their members are. Just like the real estate brokers, I would recommend interviewing several. I would find out about their experience, particularly with whatever type of transaction you're dealing with. And I would also find out about them practicing in the area, because geographic competency is important for real estate appraisers also. So same scenario again, if I live in Boulder, but I'm looking to buy property over on the Western Slope, I want to find an appraiser for that property that is familiar with the area where I'm looking in. You can definitely ask them for references as well. And just like with the real estate brokers, I would recommend that you go on our website and look at their license. Make sure that they have an active license. Definitely make sure that they're licensed here. You can check their license discipline. A lot of appraisers have licenses in multiple jurisdictions, so they may be licensed in other states. So one of the things that you might also want to do as part of your due diligence is to go on the national registry, which you can find at asc.gov, and you can search an appraiser there and see if they're credentialed in other states, and you can also see if they've been disciplined in other states. So, you know, if somebody's got a license in California and they've got some practice deficiencies in California, usually if they're having issues practicing, it's not reserved just to one state, and that could give you kind of an indication of what you might encounter here in Colorado. So with an appraiser, what they're going to do as part of your real estate transaction is their job is to provide a neutral and unbiased opinion of value. That's going to be based on market data, property types and characteristics, permissible uses, the location of the property, financing terms, the definition of value that they use, and also the highest and best use for the property. Those are just some of the factors that they're going to take into account. I know we get a lot of complaints from consumers about the appraiser didn't hit the contract price. That is not what they are here to do. They are here to value that collateral for the lender to make a lending decision if it's a mortgage transaction. So just keep that in mind. If you submit a complaint to us about, well, they didn't come in at contract price, the board doesn't have jurisdiction over value, and we are not going to investigate that complaint. And they are not here to advocate to help you get that transaction closed. They're there to value the property, and then that way, if it's a lending transaction, the lender can evaluate whether they want to take on that risk. So appraisers do have ethical standards, and they also have confidentiality requirements. And typically when you deal with an appraiser, you're going to hear two different terms come into play. One is the client, and that is the party that engages the appraiser, either directly or indirectly, for a specific assignment. And if it's a mortgage transaction, the client is going to be the lender. And then you're going to have intended users, and that is basically the client and any other party identified as users of the appraisal. So in a mortgage transaction, if I'm the borrower and I have picked a national bank as who's going to be my lender, the national bank is going to be the client. I am most likely going to be identified as an intended user. Not everybody in the transaction is privy to that appraisal. So like I said, if I'm the borrower and I'm buying a piece of property and I get the appraisal done, the appraiser, unless the client has authorized it, should not be sharing that appraisal report with the other side of the transaction, meaning the seller or the seller's broker. That would probably be a breach of confidentiality. And so due to their confidentiality requirements, the appraiser is restricted from sharing the appraisal with anyone except the client, the parties identified by the client, which are the intended users. They have to share it with the regulators, which would be us. Other parties authorized by due process of law. So if there was a lawsuit going on and they were subpoenaed, they would have to provide it. And in some instances, they're authorized to provide it to a peer review committee. And that could come into play if they've got a designation with a certain trade association. If it isn't a mortgage transaction, you're likely going to be the client as the consumer. And we see that come up when people are purchasing property with cash. We'll see it come up with probate cases, tax disputes, divorces, eminent domain proceedings. You may just choose to have your assets valued and have an appraisal done on your property. You're going to be the client in that instance. So one of the things that you need to know about when you interact with an appraiser, that in a lot of a lot of people are confused about whether they can even speak to an appraiser. You are allowed to speak to the appraiser. There's nothing that prohibits that. You can provide them with information about your property, and it's really important that if they're seeking that information, you provide it to them, because a lot of the time they're trying to figure out what updates have been done, what work have you done recently in the past 15 years. That's going to help play into kind of their evaluation of the property that ultimately goes into the value conclusion. You can also ask them to consider information about comparable properties in the area. The one thing that I need to caution you about, though, is that there's federal laws about appraisal independence. So you can talk to them. You need to be careful about how you talk to them. Anybody with an interest in the underlying transaction that tries to compensate, coerce, extort, collude, instruct, induce, bribe, or intimidate a person, usually the appraiser, an appraisal management company, or another entity that's conducting or involved in an appraisal, could be in violation of federal law. In addition to those actions, also, if you are involved in mischaracterizing the appraised value, you seek to influence an appraiser or to encourage a targeted value, you threaten to withhold payment for an appraisal report, those are also potential violations of the federal law regarding appraisal independence. And those carry some pretty hefty civil penalties. So the first offense can carry a fine of up to $10,000. Subsequent offenses could carry up to a fine up to $20,000. So it's not restricted to just the other real estate professionals involved in the transaction. You as the borrower, or basically anybody involved in that transaction that behaves in that type of manner could be in violation of that federal law. I will tell you that what we occasionally hear about from the appraisers is that they'll show up to a property to do the inspection for an appraisal, and they're met by the property owner who right out of the gate threatens with, listen, if you don't appraise that contract value, I'm going to file a complaint with DORA. So if we catch wind of that, all of our statutes have language in there about if we see what appears to be a violation of the law, we need to refer it to the appropriate law enforcement agency. We don't enforce appraisal independence. So if we hear about a property owner threatening an appraiser that way, well, that sounds like that's a violation of appraiser independence, because you're threatening them right out of the gate about a value conclusion. So we're probably going to refer you on to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or whatever agency may be responsible for enforcing appraisal independence. So just be careful with how you interact with the appraisers. Do not threaten them. A lot of the times, though, what will happen once an appraisal is done is somebody is upset about the value. They notice some errors in the report, and you can dispute that appraisal report. You can have the errors corrected. You can also have the lender ask for a reconsideration of value. They can provide additional comparable information so that the appraiser can look at other comparable properties that look more similar to the subject property. You do have that ability to dispute an appraisal. So that kind of covers how you deal with an appraiser. Jeff, do you have any questions for me on the appraisers?
You know, Marcia, you really gave a great overview there. You answered all, but I think one. I hope I didn't miss some reference to this, but I don't think you addressed this exactly. If my sister's husband is a licensed appraiser, can he appraise the house that I'm buying?
So chances are that's probably going to be viewed as a conflict of interest, which would fall under their ethical rules. So you would probably be better served not having him do your appraisal.
Okay, better safe than sorry in that circumstance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Marcia, you killed it. You answered all the other questions that were submitted. So I'm going to thank you for that, and hang on tight while we get to MLOs.
So this is our last group of licensees. These are the mortgage loan originators. And we have almost 25,000 licensed mortgage loan originators that are licensed in Colorado, although 82% of those roughly are located outside of our state boundaries. You may or may not know one. But just like the other two license types, we would recommend that you interview multiple. With a mortgage loan originator, in addition to asking about their experience, typically what they're going to do is try to find you the best rates and terms based on your individual financial circumstances. So if there's a particular loan product that you're looking for, that is something that you should ask that mortgage loan originator about, because they don't offer all of the same products. I would also ask for references just like the other ones and check them. And again, just like with the other two license types, I would go onto our licensing database and check their license. And this one really becomes important just because a lot of mortgage loan originators are licensed in multiple states. And sometimes one of the issues that we have with the mortgage loan originators is that they try to practice here and they don't have a license here. So definitely make sure that whoever you're looking at working with is licensed in the state of Colorado. They have to be licensed. Make sure they have an active license, just like the other license types, and also check for license discipline. There is another database that you can go onto, just because most of them have licenses in multiple jurisdictions, and that is a federal registry. It's called the acronym for it is the NMLS. It's the Nationwide Multi-State Licensing System and Registry. Their website, and it's all one word, is nationwidelicincingsystem.org. I will warn you, this is not the most consumer-friendly website to navigate. It's kind of information overload, but if you look on the right-hand side and go about halfway down the page, you'll find a little link for consumer access. That's where you go to look up a licensee. And like with the real estate appraisers, just because mortgage loan originators are licensed in multiple jurisdictions, I would recommend that you go onto the NMLS and look, because if they've had practice deficiencies in other states, chances are that may be reflective of the services that they provide you if they're doing business here in Colorado. And like with anybody else, if they have a disciplinary action, I would encourage you to do some further investigation. I would look at how long ago it was and what the deficiency was, because not all violations of the license law are equal. So, if they didn't take 2 hours of their continuing education credit, that's not the same as, completely just kind of becoming non-commutative to where you lose your loan lock and you end up with a higher rate mortgage. That's not the same. So with the mortgage loan originator program, there are quite a few exceptions to licensure as far as requiring a state license. So we don't license the loan originators that work for banks or credit unions. That's because banks and credit unions already have their own regulators that provide oversight. Sellers that provide financing in 3 transactions within the period of 12 months are exempt from licensure as a mortgage loan originator. Loan processors and underwriters aren't required to be licensed. We don't license loan servicers. Commercial loans don't fall within the jurisdiction of the Board of Mortgage Loan Originators in Colorado. We're only looking at residential transactions, and those are the residential mortgage loans that are primarily for personal, family, or household use that are secured by a deed of trust, mortgage, or other security interests. And that's a property with 4 or fewer residential units. That's what we're going to cover. We don't license loan originators that provide extensions of credit for timeshares. And then an attorney who renders services in the course of their practice as an attorney, and that's not primarily engaged in the business of negotiating residential mortgage loans, is exempt for licensure as well. So typically what we're going to be dealing with are the mortgage loan originators that do residential transactions that work for mortgage companies. So the mortgage loan originator's role in a transaction, what requires licensing here is for them to take an application or to offer or negotiate the terms of a residential mortgage loan. So that is what they're going to do in the transaction. But what they're going to be doing is they're going to be shopping for the best rates and terms available given the type of mortgage loan products that the company offers. And they've got certain duties when they are representing a consumer. So They have a duty of good faith and fair dealing in all communications and transactions with the borrower. So they can't recommend or induce a borrower into a loan transaction that does not have a reasonable, tangible net benefit to the borrower, considering all of the circumstances, including the terms of the loan, the cost of the loan, and the borrower's circumstances. They also have a duty to make a reasonable inquiry into the borrower's current and prospective income, existing debts, and other obligations, and any other relevant information. So on that note, when you interact with a mortgage loan originator, they're going to be asking you for confidential information that they're going to need to be able to do their reasonable inquiry and be able to shop products for you. So be prepared for that. They're not just going to take you on your word that you make X amount of money and you've been there for 10 years. You're going to have to provide some documentation. They have a duty, just like the others, to safeguard your confidential information. And one of the things that comes up from time to time that we see as far as complaints that come in from consumers is that their mortgage loan originator shared some financial information with somebody that they shouldn't have. Like they told the real estate broker something about their loan terms that they weren't authorized to share. We had one recently where, say like my son decided independently to go apply for a mortgage loan, and me being the nosy mom that I am, contacted the mortgage loan originator and asked the mortgage loan originator, well, what's my son's credit score? And the mortgage loan originator gave me the credit score information. While he's breached the confidentiality for that consumer. So that's not allowable. Other things that you need to know about interacting with a mortgage loan originator, though, is as they're going through and doing all of their duties, they can't collect a fee or a commission or compensation unless a borrower actually closes on a loan that has the terms and conditions that were agreed to. So they should not be charging you upfront fees. They can collect fees for third-party providers. So like if they need to collect the appraisal fee, they can seek to collect the appraisal fee. They can only collect the amount of the appraisal. They can't try to put undisclosed fees on top of that. And then if for some reason you never obtain an appraisal, they have to refund those fees to you. And if they do go through all of this process and they are able to obtain a loan with the terms and conditions that are agreed upon with the borrower, but the borrower fails to close due to no fault of the mortgage loan originator, the mortgage loan originator is allowed to collect up to $300 for their services rendered. So don't be surprised that if they've gone through everything to get you a loan and then suddenly you change your mind, they could collect a $300 fee for their services from you. Now, as you work with a mortgage loan originator, there are a lot of federal disclosures that they have to work with, and they're going to be making these disclosures, and this is something that you need to read. So some of the disclosures come about from federal laws like the Truth in Lending Act, the Real Estate Settlement and Procedures Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, the Telemarketing and Consumer Fraud and Abuse Protection Act. We have a state disclosure that is required, and that's the tangible net benefit disclosure form that they've got to do. And they're going to do that within 3 days of taking an application. And then if there's any subsequent changes to the loan terms, they're going to do an additional disclosure prior to or at closing. That's what we require at the state level. And then there's also lock-in disclosure forms that are either at the state or federal level, depending on what type of product you're dealing with. Those are used to lock in your loan rate. The important thing is you need to be reading all of those disclosures. And also the important thing when you deal with a mortgage loan originator is, so as they are shopping for products and they are trying to find you the best rates and terms possible, you need to be evaluating those. And when they're making these different disclosures, those disclosures are giving you the costs and the fees associated with those loans. So if your mortgage loan originator tells you, hey, you qualify for $500,000, you need to evaluate, okay, well, do I want to go up to $500,000, or am I going to be living off of ramen for the next 30 years if I go up to $500,000 in a real property purchase? Or should I be looking at something a little more conservative as far as cost is concerned? Because what you qualify for doesn't necessarily translate to what is going to be the best for you. And ultimately, that's your decision to make, but they are going to keep you well informed of the different costs and products available to you. So on that note, Jeff, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, Marcia, once again, a lot of great information there. Thank you very much. You answered quite a bit of the pre-submitted questions. Do have a few left. What's the best way for someone to go about understanding the fees that they're being charged in relation to a loan?
So I would definitely ask your mortgage loan originator about that. They should be able to walk you through the different fees.
Okay.
And also the costs.
Does an MLO have a fiduciary responsibility to their clients, meaning must they act with the best interest of their clients in mind?
Well, they've got that duty of good faith and fair dealing.
Okay.
So it's a little different than a real estate broker, but they are still should be looking out for the best of the client.
Okay, it's
and they
pretty
should
similar.
be identifying when they've got multiple products. If one product does not have very favorable terms versus the other one has very favorable terms for the consumer, they should be explaining that to them.
Great. Can someone work with more than one MLO at a time, and is it advisable?
So there's nothing that prohibits somebody from working with multiple loan originators. I do think it causes some hard feelings because just like the other license types that we regulate, they are making a very significant time investment in working for you. They don't work for free. I mean, and most of our licensees are paid once the deal closes. So if they've put in a lot of hard work and they find out that you're working with somebody else and it's kind of up in the air about who you're actually going to work with, that could cause some hard feelings for the mortgage loan originator.
Okay, something to consider then.
Yes.
Is the MLO responsible for the earnest money as a buyer if the buyer does not have a clear to close prior to the financing termination deadline?
So if you are encountering some delays in your loan getting through underwriting, it's not the mortgage loan originator's job to seek out the amend extend to push out your closing date. You need to be communicating. So your mortgage loan originator should be communicating to you about the status of your loan. You in turn then need to communicate. If you've got a real estate broker involved, you need to communicate with the real estate broker of, hey, I've got delays. Can we seek an extension of the closing date so that you don't miss the deadlines and you don't lose your earnest money deposit? And ultimately, the real estate broker is the one that drafts the amend extends for the real estate contracts. You're also dealing, though, with the other side has to agree upon that. And so if you've got a mortgage loan originator that has kept you well informed about delays, you've communicated those to the broker, and the broker has tried to extend out the contract, but then the seller says, no, I'm not going to sign an agreement, you really don't have any grounds to complain about either one of those professionals.
Okay, solid answer. Those are all of our pre-submitted questions, Marcia. I don't believe we've had any submitted during the webinar. I'm not seeing any in our chat area. So I will say thank you very much.
It looks like I did have one come in the questions for you, Marcia. As an unlicensed seller, am I allowed to provide seller financing?
So you are. The scary thing about the exemption to seller financing is there's federal law, and this came about with the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act back in 2010 that placed really some criteria that come into play for seller financing. So if you're looking at providing seller financing, and I haven't looked at the law for a long time, but essentially they expect a unlicensed seller to make the same disclosures that a mortgage loan originator would. And those are complex disclosures for a layperson. So if you're looking at seller financing, probably your best bet is to consult with an attorney or a mortgage loan originator at the very least.
Good advice. Well, Director Waters, thank you so very much for doing this. This information was wonderful. You provided a ton of information to consumers that they can use in hiring and working with real estate professionals. And again, everybody, want to let you know this is being recorded, so you will be able to go back and replay it. So we'd like to thank you all for attending and have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.